Well, I'm going to read you the dictionary definition. Executive functions are a set of cognitive processes that are necessary for the cognitive control of behavior, selecting and successfully monitoring behaviors that facilitate the attainment of chosen goals. That's not actually accurate. So it is not about just the cognitive control of behavior, or there's far more unconscious things go on with executive functioning and control of behavior, because we have non-declarative memory functions, and those are habitual behaviors. So they are happening on an unconscious level. So we have all kinds of regulation that goes through the prefrontal cortex. So I typically, the way I look at executive functioning is it's a command center of the brain that has a whole group of subfunctions that is like the control center for our thoughts, our feelings, and our actions, our behavior. And it is very different and separate from, in a lot of ways, our general intelligence. So that would be my initial starting place. But let's start. Did we get more questions?
We did. So another question.
Read them off, and then we'll gonna have a little chat first.
So one of the ones are there different stages in executive functioning?
And another.
And then I have been surprised that my kid, who has been described as goofy, is surprisingly good at getting work done under these circumstances. Does executive functioning improve with age?
Well, I think I want to just note that question, because when they said the circumstances, I would assume they mean the stay-at-home circumstances, and they're actually getting work done. And I have seen with the parents I've talked to up to this point, I'm seeing a lot of that, where a lot of these twice exceptional kids are doing extremely well now at home, managing their executive functioning, their schoolwork, which is an interesting construct. But what are the other questions?
And then somebody
go back to that.
Yeah, somebody echoed that and said, my 10-year-old's done with everything that was assigned this week. I think he likes doing things without being told.
Interesting.
Who doesn't?
So without being told, told indicates some kind of external structure, but you can't just look at it black and white like that, because there's too many other variables in the environment that affect a child's ability to initiate and sustain work in terms of their executive functioning. So when they make a comment like that, you kind of have to tuck it away, and think of it more in terms of, what else might be going on along with that? What's that? It's more like a symptom statement than it is the actual issue. It's worth exploring, though. All right, any other questions?
No, not just yet.
Okay, good.
I just got one. Dealing with a 10-year-old that won't do anything unless I'm on top of him. He's addicted to jumping on TV or phone. More of a statement.
Well, that's your neck of the woods, Mark.
Yeah. I like to call that they enter into their default mode. When they're not really processing what they need to be doing or how they need to be doing it, they just slip right into that, and it comes up. It's as easy as breathing. I stray away from addiction, although I do believe addiction is real for process addictions like that. But for me, it's more they're slipping into just a very comfortable default mode where they're not utilizing their executive functions to explore alternatives or break out of that. It's more of a skill issue.
And for some of these kids, there's been a total change in their structural environment. So what they're used to in terms of their day being structured is gone. Mm-hmm. And for some of these kids, it's going to be hard to get them back into some routine. And by the way, right now might not be the time to have that fight, because we're going into a space right now where we haven't even entered cultural shock on what's happening. So we're still in a transition, and there's a lot of stuff going on for people in this transition. And it's not a time to become militant about executive functioning with the kids. There's too many other priorities right now. Now, As this thing starts to go on, then it becomes a matter of how are we going to build structure into their life effectively with what they can handle given the current life stressors. Because it can't be the same as normal, and it can't be an overload of structure either. There's too many other variables going on with the family and society and culture. We don't want to overload them with a lot of executive function demands. That would be my take on it. Not that they shouldn't have any.
More of a balance.
Yeah.
So I'm going to kind of jump in here and switch into more of an interview style with Andy.
Go ahead.
And introduce ourselves a little bit too. You know, Andy, I work at the Center for Identity Potential. Andy founded the center out in Chicago. How many years ago?
I think it was in 2010.
2010. Our center primarily works with the gifted and talented population of all age ranges, but a lot of our main clientele are kids. I myself am in the Metro Detroit area, opening up a satellite office out here that I run with another counselor. And we specialize in working with the gifted population, twice exceptionalism, all the other things that come with it, sensory processing, ADHD, and OCD, all that stuff, you name it. And so today we want to focus on executive functioning, how that affects these bright kids, how it affects you, and the correlation between the two. And I just want to start out just asking Andy, how did you get into working with kids and executive functioning?
Okay, so it was the late 80s. And at that time, the only people that really talked about executive functioning were good psychometricians, psychologists, neuropsychologists who did really good neuropsych or regular psych testing. They understood this part of the brain. They understood the nature of executive function and how important it was to learning and processing information and organization, et cetera. So I had the fortune of, at the time, my center was in Washington, D.C., and I had met some brilliant testers that I worked with, and one in particular, his name was Michael Gennari. He still works in the field. He's a great psychologist in D.C., and he taught me about executive functioning. Now, back in those days when you went to a school meeting and you would talk about executive functioning to a group, counselors, you know, a parent-teacher conference, people thought you were a quack. They didn't want, they couldn't understand it. It was voodoo to them. The kids were just, you know, they just needed to straighten out. And they were just, you know, they were judging children more as a moral failure than having actual problems with executive functioning. So at that time, it was very difficult, even though we understood some learning disabilities better, and we knew a lot about ADD, we still know just about the same amount in some ways, in terms of what people know. That we know a lot more in other ways, but it was hard to get people to understand that the brain actually had these processes, that this was not just a lazy kid. Mm-hmm. And so over the years, what I did was I just kept studying and learning about it and working with neuropsych testing. And I did the first national presentation on executive functioning in gifted children. And that was back in the early 90s. And the room was packed because people were like, it was new. They were like, what is this stuff? Now, one of the problems was this. It was like somebody had given them this manual on how to get children to perform, which was really dangerous. Because when you focus on executive functioning with the intent to get children to perform better, particularly gifted children, you're going down the wrong path. Because it's too behavioral, it can be too contrived and too controlled. And what people forget is there's a developmental process going on here. That in general, people don't develop their prefrontal cortex, where the executive functions are, until their mid to late 20s. So there are people who are advanced in that development, But what we know about gifted people, some of their physiological development and brain development can be delayed. And what I say about giftedness is it's human nature in extreme. So you think about the prefrontal cortex. It's a physiological aspect of the brain. It's a part of the brain that develops late. Well, if giftedness in some ways can be seen as extremes, and it can be not developing as fast as the general intelligence part of the brain or other parts of the brain, you're going to have asynchrony. Now, not every gifted person is like that, but a large portion of them are like that because they have different developmental stages than the norm. That's a long answer for a quick question, wasn't it? Sorry about that.
Well, as you relate it to development, and there's some questions in the chat regarding, are executive function skills cumulative? Do they build off of each other? Can they apply to more behaviors, or can you graduate kids, to the next level? So the question is, does it just develop out normally, or can you have executive function skills as an adult?
Well, the first, I would say yes to those questions. Now, do me a favor, just spearhead the question somehow. Right. Say that the last part again, the thing you asked me.
Well, you were talking about it as developmental. So does it eventually get to a point where as long as you get older, it gets there? I mean, I know the answer.
Yeah, maybe.
Maybe.
So if there's a discrepancy between your executive functioning issues, some of your learning processes in that part of the brain, and your general intelligence, so what people would call twice exceptional. So you have learning issues developmentally in relationship to high intelligence. Now, you may have average developed executive function, but because you have other parts of your brain that are advanced processes, you could say, I'm simplifying this, right? You have this dilemma that it can manifest as a learning problem, even though developmentally they might be right on track as a normal person, right? Now, if gifted development was so simple, that would be one very simplified answer for the problem. But it's not like that. Everybody's unique. Everybody has their own extremes in their development. So there's what we call scatter in gifted people. So the further out you get on that bell curve, the more scatter you have in development. So some people may not develop some of those skills, executive functions, sub-functions, well into adulthood. The absent-minded professor is a good example of a brilliant person who has poor executive functioning. They lose the students' papers. They don't grade on time. They're late for class. I mean, it's a stereotype, but it really is a metaphorical stereotype around a brilliant mind with poor executive function. And then you have the problems that come with that, the denial that they have a problem with it, So they don't compensate, they don't accommodate, they don't actually spend the time to try to develop the skills. And what we want to do in our work is to help people understand where they are, what their profile is, right? And then what scaffolding is needed when developmentally in that process along the way.
Do you want me to pull up your PowerPoint?
Sure. Mark, have you ever had any of these executive function problems?
Oh. Oh, of course not. Yeah, every day of my life. And for me, it's interesting because they were always there. But because my natural intelligence allowed me to kind of cruise through school, I always had a way, they were undetected.
Right.
So my gap wasn't so extreme that I was having problems in class or having behavioral issues or getting upset or whatever it was. My dilemma came later. For me, it was in college.
Yeah. So do me one favor, flip to a prettier overhead.
Oh, yeah. Sorry.
Oh, I said overhead. I dated myself. There you go. Leave it there.
Yeah, go back. Okay.
That's a good one. Yeah, that one. But okay. So, yeah. So let me ask you this. So knowing that I put a lot of focus on executive functioning in people, right? What was it like to come to work with us?
I'm laughing because, if I look back, it was at times really stressful. because there was an expectation that I deal with these problems, and then I had to acknowledge that they were a problem, or even be aware that I had it as a problem. So me showing up late to something was such a norm for me that I couldn't understand why somebody would be upset that I was showing up late. I'm like, well, so what?
So tell them, when was the first time you were late?
I was late to my initial interview for the job. So that's probably not a good place to start. But even at that time, I was like, well, things happen, life keeps spinning, But it was called out that, you got to be where you need to be. My time is all this kind of stuff. So there was a challenge in that, but there was also a response where I could see, I get what you're saying. I know on some level, but I was, but it was difficult.
Yeah. So we always, we ride a fine line, don't we? We make sure that we're not overly zealous or controlling about it, but we as individuals want to make sure that we are practicing what we preach. Now, a parent just asked an interesting question there about what they can do to aid their child in developing executive functions. So what I want to say is, we'll talk a little bit about subfunctions here in a minute, is you've got to do your own inventory on where you're at with the executive functioning in your life. And you can't try to just project through them and make them change that behavior or develop those skills if you yourself are not dealing with those issues, because I promise you it will not work. Because children learn from doing, they learn from mentoring, modeling, particularly when it comes to executive functions. So what we've done over the years is we teach people that you want to teach executive functions as a secondary effect. So if you have a child who is having trouble, let's say primarily with schoolwork, you don't want the tutor to come or the coach to come and put executive function demands on a child at the end of the day. You want them to come and actually take the child through the work. You want them to push them through it by doing it with them, but not sitting there and telling them to do it. Because, by the way, they've probably never seen it done effectively or had anybody do it with them. So in some ways, you've got to really understand each, we'll go into them, but you really got to understand how you're approaching it from the standpoint of yourself. Do you really have this down, or are you just trying to live vicariously through them? Some of you could relate to that image on the screen, I'm sure. Now, she knows exactly where everything is. And if you tried to tell that woman that she should get some help with organization, she's brilliant. She's going to tell you, oh, no problem. If you try to touch it, it's going to mess up my life, And I can assure you, she's not going to be in that job very long. And if she does stay in the job, she's going to develop secondary stress effects from living that way. You can go ahead, Mark, and flip. We're not going to do that tonight. All right. We talked a little bit about the bell curve. I'm just going to say this. The further out you get on that curve, the more asynchronous things get for people in terms of intelligence, the brain, development, their nature. So that dotted line going up is called the asynchrony curve, coined by me. And that curve basically represents the scatter that occurs in human nature when you get far out on a curve. And that's where you start to see struggles that get really extreme in terms of the makeup for some gifted people when it comes to their ability to sustain and function with executive functioning. So go ahead. Don't jump over that. Yeah, keep going. Yeah, right there. That's good. No, go over that. We go to the next one. This is really important because a lot of people think that executive function equates with intelligence. It does not. It absolutely does not equate. So just because people aren't good with executive functioning does not mean that they're stupid or that they're average ability or whatever. Everybody struggles with executive function, and gifted people have their own particular struggles sometimes with it. Now, you can have gifted people who are gifted with executive function. Remember, not all giftedness is cookie cutter, one model, one belief system, one paradigm. I just wrote a really interesting piece that addresses that for the Gifted Homeschoolers Forum. please support that. They have a whole group of people who are writing articles. And you can go to our website. There's a link there with the article, and you can find other articles from the Gifted Homeschooling Forum. They're doing a lot of good stuff right now. They have a great team of people who are editing and producing these articles. So go ahead and go to the next one. Again, the higher the intelligence, you could actually say there's actually more executive dysfunction in a general sense. Go ahead. Yeah, that was the control. So this is some of the stuff that the frontal lobe does. So when we talk about executive functioning, we're talking about the prefrontal cortex. So we want to make sure that people understand what actually that does separate from other parts of the brain. So here's simple things, it keeps your mind from wandering, it helps you focus, it turns on and off signals.
So in addition to being the command center, it's also a regulation center. So
totally, that's the best way to, it's really, yeah, I like that.
Because when you're dealing with kids that have executive function issues, sometimes that is their inability to regulate themselves. And that's not, it could be perceived as a lot of different things, but sometimes it's just straight up executive function issues.
It is. Well, all of that control comes out of the prefrontal cortex. So kids who are hypermotor, whether they're gifted and they're hyperkinetic or they're hyperactive, it's all frontal lobe, whether people like it or not. That's what it is. And you don't really you can't really fully tweak out what that is unless you really do good neuropsych testing. And you can't, because nobody should do an armchair diagnosis on ADHD, particularly with a gifted child. So this kind of gives you a little overview of all of what it generally does. And if you take any one of those, you can see, wow, if it's not working, you can have a lot of dysfunction, dysregulation in your life. So if you're not functioning, you're going to fuel things like addictive behavior. A lot of these kids become very rigid sometimes because they don't have the ability to transition. It's one of the subfunctions. So they become what we call rigidly inflexible.
And it comes back to the video game stuff too. This is where that part comes in here. That's the becoming addicted to falling unconscious and structured behavior. That's basically where they're going. If they're not accessing any level of being able to transition into something else.
Yeah, it's not real mindful when they're playing those games.
Right.
Not any mindfulness going on. I do want to say that when people talk about mindfulness, there's far more to mindfulness than getting in a lotus position and doing a little Zen meditation. Mindfulness is being actually in the moment. There's an immediacy to it. It's the ability to utilize the prefrontal cortex. So when I work, one time somebody asked me, do you ever fall asleep? Do you ever daydream when you're working? I said, no, I work. When I'm on, I'm on. I'm mindful. I'm in the moment. I'm conscious. I'm using my declarative memory. I'm right in the moment. Everything is getting processed as best as possible right then. That's mindfulness also. So it's not just turning out the other waves and all that kind of stuff. That's also mindfulness. Go on to the next one there. This is just an example of, you have a lot of disorders and stuff that can be affected or affected by or affected because of prefrontal cortex issues. But I don't want to get into that tonight. It gets too clinical. Subfunctions. So we're going to go through each of these, but let's look at the questions for a second. You got a lot of piling up there.
Let's go back a little bit. What are some ways a parent can assist a kid in developing executive function skills to ease their navigation through the day? You talked a little bit about that, about recognizing it in yourself.
Well, when we get through the list, you can take each one of those and you can create your own activities for each one. And you can look at what the demands are in the day, and you can do your own focus on how you can develop one at a time or a group of them.
And the other thing that we suggest sometimes, and Andy, you let me know if that's not appropriate, but you don't have to do all of them perfectly. Sometimes it's okay to pick a subfunction, one thing that you really want to improve upon or help support in. And
Yes.
just make that your goal. And that
because they're interconnected.
Right.
They're all interconnected. And Russell Barkley, who's the expert on ADD, he would tell you that it's all working memory. So he looks at it from the context of all those subfunctions are interconnected processes. So that's a good point.
And then how do we know what is the best school situation? Ooh, that's a hard one.
That was last week's talk.
Just last month, yeah.
We're going to do that again.
It's very individualized and it changes year to year. That's a hard one.
Yeah. That's like another dissertation for us, but we could help them later. Tell them to call us.
Yeah, that's true. We can help with that. And then that's it for the questions for right now. So you want to go into each of the subfunctions?
Is arguing over everything part of exact? Yeah, that's a good one though. The last one that popped up.
Oh, I just saw that. Yeah.
Okay. People who argue like that over everything, contrarians, that actually is a symptom of a processing issue going on in terms of their executive functioning. So what they're trying to do is get you to process something for them. So it's an external processing technique that people use. It's the same thing when a gifted kid asks 50 million questions. That's an indication of a learning problem. That's not just an inquisitive child. They're actually doing something called external processing. And that's something that you have to look at and help them work with, and then help them with how they're processing information. Because otherwise, what happens with a lot of parents with that is they just get exhausted by the questions, and then they say, well, I have to answer his questions, or, I'm failing. No, actually, if you try to answer all of his questions, you're kind of insane, and you should come get help. There's something going on with the executive functioning in that case, even in the argumentative. So that's a rigidly inflexible person who's having a trouble processing information. So they're very dependent on what they know or what they want the outcome to be. Very symptomatic of executive function problems.
There's a question about transitioning, but I think we can move.
Yeah, we can talk about that when we get to that.
As we go here, and I'll make sure we touch on that question.
There's such a nice quiet audience. They're not yelling or anything right now. We can't hear them, so we should let one of them speak once in a while. Can't see
the lottery system.
Right. So here's the starter button, initiating, right? So, well, before I get into all these, the best resource for this is somebody, we need to put this out there somehow, but Peg Dawson's work. She's kind of the mother of executive functioning. She's the guru, Peg Dawson. So Dawson.
And she does a great job outlining specific techniques. She has whole workbooks. She has everything. She'll take each subfunction and outline options you can do according to developmental age and things like that. So different for teens than it is for younger guys and stuff. So
yeah. So if you want a more scholarly view on it and a more organized view than us, you go look at Peg Dawson's videos and listen to Peg Dawson. She's, her work is very, very good. She is the basic primer. Mm-hmm. So initiating. So this is the starter button. And this is when kids people have trouble getting started, right? Well, getting started is a skill. Initiation is a skill. So when I look at executive functions, I look at them as skills that have to be developed. So does the child have a skill to initiate work? Now, if you're asking a child to come home from a day where they're already taxed, they're stressed, they've been compensating all day, and then they have to come home and do homework. What is homework? It's pure executive function. And then you're asking them after they are, especially these twice exceptional kids, they come home, they're exhausted, and you want them to sit down and initiate their homework. Well, good luck with that. Because one is they probably don't even have the energy to begin to know how to initiate, nor have they, without structure, have ever probably learned how to self-initiate with certain things. Now, if it's an interest area, that's different. And we know that specifically with testing kids and over time. People say, well, I know she can do it because I see her do it when she has to do her hobbies or whatever. Well, that's because they have an interest area in there. It plays to their strengths. And there's a lot of variables coming together that's motivating them. But when it's something that's hard for them, that's challenging them in other areas of their vulnerability, they're not going to necessarily be able to pull it off. And that's when you hear that statement from people, I know she can do it, I've seen her do it somewhere else, that's a diagnostic indicator of a problem. So the thing I say is you've got to find ways to develop, obviously we can't do that here, but you find ways to teach the child how to initiate something. Some people do it, I'll give you a simple way. Some people do by sitting down, and first thing they do is start to write down everything they have to do. And then you have to put it in a sequence, prioritize it. That will actually create an initiating behavior. So go on to the next.
Yeah, well, I'd add on to that a little bit is sometimes creating, getting your physical environment and changing that, where you're setting it up or you're getting all the supplies you need, everything and this is what helps me too.
Yes.
Changing your environment or getting it all set up, having everything prepared and ready to go. So when you sit down, you're more engaged and you're switching. Yeah. That's another way to create initiation.
Here's another one. We'll just add to it. I mean, we could go on all night with these, sure. But the other one is like, I have a studio, and when I walk in my studio, everything is set for me to initiate creative behavior because everything. I know where everything is. It's a state that you go into. That's why you shouldn't do your homework in your bedroom kind of thing. You know, you shouldn't work unless you're limited for space, but the spaces are designed. I do interior design. Spaces are designed to have a function for a reason. So a child should study in the same place every day. Now, it could be at the kitchen table where you're watching them, that's fine. But it's got to be consistent. When people get to college, you'll notice college students do this naturally. They'll find one cube at the library that they'll study in, or one little hole that they'll crawl in and study. They're doing it for a reason. It allows them to initiate the activity. Go ahead, Mark.
Sure.
Focusing is kind of explanatory, but the ability to keep your attention on something and is a skill again. It's like, do I know how to tune out what I need to tune out to put my energy here or not? Now, people will say with ADD, they'll say, well, it's not that he can't pay attention. It's that he pays attention to everything. Well, that's actually a skill. So when I'm doing art, or like when I'm painting, I like to be in an open space and I pay attention to everything. When I'm writing, I want to be in a focus space, a different kind of focus. I don't want all that visual distraction around me. But I know how to get my focus to work. It's kind of like a lens on a camera or a telescopic lens. You should think of focusing that way. It requires adjustments and tweaks in where your energy is going in terms of that process. What first probably needs to happen is you need to explain to a child what the process of focusing is, so that they understand the mechanisms. I can't get into it. You'd have to read about it. But explain, gifted kids would love it, some of them. Explain to them how focusing works. It's just like a camera lens. And then translate it to themselves and their brains and their bodies. Go ahead, Mark.
Sure. We have a question here too, which is our son.
Oh, we're at our question limit. I can't take anyone. Just kidding.
Our son argues, has sensory and space issues, impulse issues, yet is organized in his schoolwork and homework on his own. Is this part of the scatter?
Well, that's a good depiction of what I was talking about earlier. In certain areas, he's got it together. In other areas, he doesn't develop the skills. But here's this thing you got to look for. When a child is, if that child, I don't know if that child is, but let's say that child is overcompensating at school. They're working extra hard with their executive functioning, and they are mustering up the energy to do it, right? And they're producing, but they're hypervigilant. So when they come home or when they go offline, they cannot get it back online. They don't need to be organized. They can't regulate. And that's a diagnostic indicator that there could be hypervigilance going on for the child. And guess what hypervigilance does? It disrupts your sleep. It creates anxiety. It does all kinds of things. So when we test kids, our neuropsych tester comes back and tells us if the child is suffering with hypervigilance or not. People don't realize how hypervigilant they are when they're overcompensating. And then that's stress in their body, in their life, and then it's affecting their life. And they don't even understand that it's their executive functioning that's getting overworked in certain areas. It could even be their interest area, but because they're vulnerable in certain areas, and you'll look at them and say, well, look, all their executive functioning is working. I said, yeah, it's working at a price. It's a huge price, you know? It's what's happening to a lot of people right now. People's executive functioning is either hypervigilant or underfunctioning because of what they're up against. It's all new. Wait, what? No, I heard a voice.
Somebody's not muted.
Was that your daughter?
No, but that happened where she's come into one of my sessions.
Oh, okay.
I'm not sure.
You can go ahead.
Okay.
Prioritizing.
We're on prioritizing right now.
Oh, you want to talk about that one? Good. I'm going to take a sip of water.
Sure. Sometimes, one of the functions of prioritizing, this can appear as overwhelm. You have so much. There's so much going on. It's a million things, and you can list them all off. But there's no order to it in your head. There's no hierarchy. There's no determination of what's most. There's just not processing things as clearly. So,
hey, Mark, somebody has their mic open.
I have to.
I don't know who it is, but somebody has their background noise is coming through, and I can't process.
I think I can fix that. Give me a sec.
If somebody has their, make sure you're all muted because somebody. There we go. Okay.
I think I got it.
See, there's a good example of executive functioning. See, I have auditory processing issues. And in order for me to stay on task, I can't have refractory noise and I can't have visual distraction. So when I have refractory noise like that, like a background, somebody's mic is open, it totally throws me off. I can't stay in sequence. I can't retrieve information. The same thing visually. I'm sitting here and there's a stink bug in my living room on a piece of pottery. Now, I've been ignoring it a while, but my visual ability is, every now and then I get drawn to that stink bug who's doing like some kind of a rain dance around the top of the pot. And I hope he stops because I want sunshine tomorrow. But see how it takes my brain totally away from what I'm working on. And in order to get back to the work, I have to acknowledge that, oh, okay, that's what's happening. Then I come back and I say, okay, now I got to tune it out. But then I have to be hypervigilant. So if that background noise was continuing, I could still do the job, but I would be creating agitation in my system. I could feel it. It starts to create a little anxiety and my left palm gets sweaty. Okay. So those are all indicators of stressors related to my executive functioning and what it takes to be able to do this. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, that's fine. And, to me, it's just real life examples of how executive function appears all the time. Mm-hmm. And Andy gave a good example of what's necessary to first call out that it's happening and then go through some cognitive processes of what he needs and getting help, to get back to where
yeah, that's a good compensating skill. See, what I do is, some people would never stop this show and say, look, I can't focus with the noise, right? But what I've learned is that if you're, like, say you're the presenter, you're responsible to your audience. And if it's going to disrupt what you're able to deliver, there's nothing wrong with stopping and compensating for what you need as a presenter or as a teacher or as a student, because we want to teach kids how to take responsibility for what they need to be functional in life. We want a kid to self-advocate. We want a kid to be able to know when they get, let's say, to college, that they know where to sit in an auditorium for a lecture. those are the kind of skills we teach, right? Prioritization, I want to go back to that for a second though, because that's a fun one to teach because it's all about values. So a simple exercise would be you take, let's say you have 5 things to do. You write them down, and then basically, or 6 things, and you can do a forced choice where you take the first 2, forced choice, second 2, forced choice, third set, forced choice. Then you can do a forced choice on 2 of those and a forced choice on 2 of those. And you keep doing forced choices. And then what you'll find out is that you're training the brain to prioritize. I usually do this visually, but I can't. You're training the brain to evaluate and assign value through the forced choice, and the prioritization starts to build a hierarchy. So then you start to know what things have a higher value than the others. But we don't teach people how to prioritize, ever. It's so bizarre. It's one of the skills that teachers should adopt. It's very simple. If you want to simplify it, you sit down, you really should write it out, and then you should assign value. Value scale 1 to 10. In art, when I paint, I look at the landscape and I assign value. And that's very important.
So what about if a kid is, you ask them to assign value, but they're assigning value to playing video games or watching TV. They're saying that has more value in the prioritization.
I don't like that question. You answer it.
Well, it's a form of denial. It's a form of manipulating the system.
Totally.
Yeah. But as a parent, you have to say, look, you kind of got to, you can smile about it, but you got to call it on the BS.
Well, look, the parent should be in a situation where they say, look, these are our family values.
Right.
Here's our priorities. Value means math. It's all about math. So if you think of it that way, if you think about your family values as math, where in the hierarchy of those values does video games fit? Now, my belief is that video games fit in a certain place, right? They should be an earned privilege,
Mm-hmm.
and they should be limited.
So the prioritizing it's more systemic in that case
yes,
it's
not
bigger. Just the child's own. Yeah, it's bigger.
But I think as Adlerians, what we were taught in the early days, we use the program STEPS, Systematic Training for Effective Parenting, which we should teach all over the place again, right? But when you start to look at family process, one of the things you do is you help the family develop a hierarchy of values. You help the family develop a family contract and an understanding of a fair exchange of energy within the family, in terms of people's responsibilities, their chores, their participation, and what's needed priority-wise in terms of for this family to function.
Mm-hmm.
Now, when the family gets upside down, it's when the kids are on top of it all. In Adlerian psychology, we call it the benevolent dictator.
Right.
Parents aren't dictators, nor are they benevolent. They should be benevolent dictators. All right, enough of my
prioritizing of the family hierarchy too. Okay.
Here I am preaching to parents. I don't even have kids. I hate kids. What the heck? All right, go ahead. It's great when you can't see the audience. You have no idea how they're reacting. They should send us a chat message. How's it going? Are you learning anything?
We have people asking more about the sleep stuff. I don't know if you want to address that or if that's going to go.
Oh, that's a good
little
one.
Emoji. Thanks, Nicole.
Oh, I don't want to see that emoji.
No, it's a good one. It's a good one. Do we want to deal with the sleep stuff or?
Well, not yet. The sleep thing that's a good lecture. It's a good question.
Right.
But I'll just say something simple first. Executive functioning issues and skills are totally tied to sleep. It's about regulation of the system, how to turn remember it said on the earlier slide, when we got into talking about what the brain controls, a lot of these kids can't turn it off at night. But part of that is because we don't teach them to turn it off at night, and we don't set limits. And we have to teach them skills like meditation. We also have to teach them how to do certain activities that exhaust themselves physically, instead of because the physical piece, we haven't talked about it, but so many gifted kids don't get enough physical activity. and they're not physically challenged, and they need to be. And we have a cultural problem with that for a lot of people. So there's a lot more to sleep, but inhibition, impulsivity. I like this one because I always use my example of shopping at, for people who are shopaholics, TJ Maxx and Home Goods. I have a cure for impulse buyers. So basically what you do is you, if you're like me, I love that place. You park as far out in the parking lot as you can from the door. You leave your wallet in the car, obviously lock the door, and you go in and you shop and you buy like you normally do. You buy everything you normally would throw in your cart. And then when you're satiated and you've got everything, you get up close to the register and you realize you don't have your wallet. And you have to walk all the way back to the car. And by the time you get back to the car, your brain will process out and it will prioritize and evaluate. It'll go through all the subfunctions and it will determine whether or not you really need to buy what you thought you needed to buy. And then some people won't even go back in the store. They'll just leave the cart, which is fine. But you go back in and you'll realize, wait a minute, you'll start putting things back on the shelf. Now, that happens with impulsivity all the time, where we don't put barriers in place of the behavior. Now, unfortunately, we're not going to have time to go through all that tonight, but that's a good one.
Yeah. I'll say predict and prescribe. If you can predict that the behavior is going to happen, then you need to prescribe it ahead of time. Be prepared.
Mm-hmm.
There we go.
Go ahead. What do you got? Goal setting.
Yeah.
Again, it's one of those, everybody kind of knows what it is, but it's one of those things that people don't typically do. I'm not going to say too much about that. It's kind of self-explanatory. It's important. The only thing is you got to be willing, when you set a goal, you got to be flexible within that process at times. Mm-hmm. You can't be totally rigid because then you don't allow for growth and change during the process of achieving the goal. Go ahead.
Okay.
Keep going. Sequencing. This is a tough one for some people, is following the sequence.
I found this one to be a lot more subtle than people realize.
Go ahead.
So for me, it's like an issue I have with sequencing is sometimes I'll be really anxious about making a phone call to somebody. And in my head, I'm like, I just got to make the call, just make the call. But what I really don't have is enough information about what the call is about, what I really need, what my anxiety is really about. So typically I'll call Andy. But I'm not going through a real proper process of what I'm going to need to effectively make a phone call in the way that I want to make it, or whatever it is. And so really what has happened is I'm struggling with sequencing. I'm jumping ahead to the action rather mm-hmm. than really going through what makes that action really effective.
Yeah. I think one way to deal with sequencing is to take something that you've done or that the child has done and then deconstruct the sequence for them. So start with the reverse. So instead of trying to teach them how to go from step 1 to step 5, take a process, break it down, and explain to them how that got created in a sequence. Because again, it's another one of these subfunctions that we never teach people at a primary level. This is the one thing I've learned about executive functioning over the years. Most of these we've never taught. We make assumptions. On to the next. In the sequence here, we have planning. So sequencing and planning are connected. See, they're all kind of connected. It's important to separate them out, though, and understand them separately. So in terms of planning, what I find fascinating is adults use a lot of project management tools in a lot of different industries. We don't do a lot of that with kids in school. We don't really do project management. And if somebody was smart, they would develop a project management program for kids in high schools in particular, because they leave high school, they go into college. Even in college, they don't teach project management. There's just, people just make so many assumptions. Like you take a a term paper, or, kids have to write a term paper. That is pure executive functioning. Expository writing requires an enormous amount of internal executive functioning. And we don't really teach the process. Kids don't even know how to organize, how to do research and annotate and gather that information in a functional way so that they can retrieve it and pull it together in their working memory. Enough of my lecture on that one, though. Sustaining. I love this one. This is my favorite. This is the one that people never get. They never get it. Because what happens is, it's similar to what I said earlier. They see somebody do something, and then they make this assumption that, well, I've seen them do it. Why can't they keep doing it? Well, because the prefrontal cortex regulates the body. And the body, it only has a certain developed skill, a certain energy level, and all of that has to be in sync. So when you say to a kid, I want you to sustain an entire school year with a certain level of performance, and they have executive function problems, that's why in February and March, we become quite wealthy, because in the third semester of the 4 semesters, guess what happens? Or the quarter is, that's when people can no longer sustain the executive functioning. They're spent. The same thing happens in a classroom hour. The same thing happens in a day. If they have problems with sustaining, they're not going to be able to make it through normal cycles. They're going to have adjustments. They're going to have to build endurance. That's where pacing comes in. I think that's the next one. Go ahead.
Sure.
Emotional control. I thought it was pacing. Go to pacing.
Yeah. Can we just get over
yeah, there. So think about pacing. You have a kid who's in track and they don't know how to pace, and they haven't been trained how to pace. It's not going to help their performance. Again, this is where athletically executive functions affect your sports performance. So everybody, it's not just academic. You can apply this to everything you do, right? So if you're working with a student and track and they're having trouble with long distance running, then you have to evaluate their ability to pace and train them. A good coach knows how to train people in pacing. I'm not going to get into that right now, but there is a way to do it.
But it's also more relevant to let's say a kid goes through this period where they just, they got a blank slate. It's a new semester and they're like, okay, I do want to do it better. They get this sense of motivation, and then they try to do all these huge sweeping changes.
Right.
And they're not pacing themselves. They're not setting their expectations correctly given their skill level. And so eventually they can't sustain it out. And then they start to think, oh, organizing and planning doesn't work for me.
Exactly.
I don't like to use calendars. Well, it's because they've had this try, start, fail cycle repeated so many times because they're not really dealing with this pacing issue.
Right. Yeah, there's a lot more to pacing. We can't get into it tonight, but we can.
Oops. Oh, I'm going to go backwards, not forwards.
Yeah, go backwards for a second. We were back to emotional control.
Ah, there we go.
Yeah, that one. Okay. I don't need to say anything here, do I now? The prefrontal cortex controls the amygdala. So when a kid melts down or they're dysregulated, it's because the prefrontal cortex is not working. And so when a child has a meltdown, the last thing you want to do is try to get them to get in control of it. You need to stand back, keep them safe, and get far away, because once their prefrontal cortex emotionally dysregulates, they're not coming back online for quite a while. You can go to the next one.
Mm-hmm.
This is shifting, transitioning. This is where people become very rigidly inflexible because they don't have the ability to transition from one experience to the next. Now, what I've learned over the years is I work with all different industries, right? In my other job, consulting. So people say, well, how can you do that? How can you go from working with a lawyer in Manhattan to working with a corporate spy, then to work in the film industry, and then you go over there and you work in commercial real estate, and then you go to the next one and you're working with somebody on a script Now, how do I do that? Because I've trained my brain to transition very rapidly. So I have foundational platforms, in a sense, metacognitive processes, and I can shift and I can rapidly learn information, and I can plug that information in, and I can get right back up to speed. And it's I love the transitioning part now. I love the ability to shift from one to the next, to the next, to the next. On a simple level, kids need to be wound down and then wound back up. You see this in schools all the time, where teachers will wound the kids up and then send them off to the next classroom. Every kid should be wound down before they go on to the next wound up, you know? That's just a simple example.
Here's a question about helping with emotional outbursts. It says, anything to help with emotional outbursts. We have learned to step away, but it would be great to help them learn how to calm down easier.
Prescribe and predict. I mean, predict and prescribe.
Yeah.
It's a simple version. Predict and prescribe works this way. You have to get to them when they're calm. You have to have a history of the behavior. You can't just confront them with one experience. So you have to say, look, Susie, you have to be ambivalent. I may be wrong, Susie, but let's have a conversation about this. And I've made note here of 5 experiences where I think, you emotionally were not able to really regulate real well. And I thought maybe we could have a conversation about it and talk about maybe what's happening there. And maybe we could prescribe some alternatives, right? I'm really simplifying this. This is something we do in a session over time, right? But what happens is you have to give them a metacognitive strategy ahead of time. So you have to kind of predict what they do. And then you have to discuss a strategy about what are you going to do when. You also have to help them understand what are the precursors, the triggers and the cues that lead to the emotional meltdown. If you try to deal with an emotional meltdown during or after, all right, and not do anything preventative, all you're going to do is reinforce it.
The same thing,
absolutely reinforce it.
The same thing goes with trying to get them to see that they need to calm themselves down. Because again, what
absolutely.
we're talking about is this is a skill-based issue. So it is strike when the iron is cold. It is predict and prescribe, and it's helping them come up with different strategies for them to work out. But you really have to, if the expectation is they know how to do it and they're choosing not to do it, you're in trouble.
Right. One other thing I want to add to that, in terms of a lot of these kids, some of them are emotionally very sensitive. They pick up everybody else's emotions.
That's true.
They pile them on. Adults do this too, where they'll be feeling something, they'll be overwhelmed, and it's not really their feeling. It's their spouse, it's their client, it's their student, it's somebody at work, and they've never learned to regulate their own emotional state. And so they come home from work, they're loaded, they then absorb their spouse's tension at work, and then they have an explosive meltdown, and then they project anger, and they get into a big fight, then they get divorced, and the whole 9 yards. The reality is this: there's an aspect of it where when they're having that emotional meltdown, you also have to be, like you said, aware of what you're doing, what's going on with you. They may be reacting to the fact that you're stressed, or you're sad, or you're upset about something, and they don't know how to separate that out. Then they have their own stress of doing their work or whatever on top. Go ahead.
And then, one more question. What if the emotional outburst develops internally and not externally? How can we help the child calm down?
I don't know.
I think
a stiff Manhattan. No,
yeah.
Just kidding. No,
Yeah,
I'm
right.
kidding.
A little whiskey on the gums.
Internally, it's the same thing. You've got it. Even though it may look like it's not a big deal, that's where you got to realize, hey, honey, you're not talking.
Well, and that's the issue too, because if you're saying internally, like anxiety, anxiety can be a lot of stuff. It's not just about, bring your anxiety down. You really need help getting to the root of it. And for kids that struggle to externally or verbally get to a place of saying what's going on, then you need extra help.
Plus, we're too complacent with that. We think, okay, well, they're not screaming and yelling, so that's fine, right? Now, you got to know the person. You got to know when they're holding it in. I can tell when my husband's angry and he's not telling me. He kind of does this internalizing thing. He just shuts down, and I can just tell, and he starts doing weird stuff. And I'm like, I know you're angry. It's like, you're not fooling me.
I can hear it in the way you're loading the dishwasher.
Yeah. He's in the other room, probably wondering why I'm talking about him, using him as an example. Organizing, enough said. We know what organizing does. It's very helpful. Pacing, self-monitoring. It's all self-monitoring, really.
Yeah.
But self-monitoring is the ability to step back and kind of watch all of your executive functioning going on. It's like the ability to say, okay, how am I doing? I'm monitoring all these processes of self, in our work, Mark, we do a lot of this, don't we? We're always processing thoughts, feelings, behavior.
Right.
What's the other ones? Self, other, context.
Mm-hmm.
What we're doing there is we're training everybody to work in a way where they're paying attention to themselves, they're paying attention to the context they're working in with the client, and they're paying attention to the client. And we do the same thing with cognition, affect, and behavior. We're always monitoring the congruency of those three.
And
Are they congruent?
Yeah,
Are they in alignment?
Right.
Yeah.
I just wanted to add to, because self-monitoring, it almost seems a little restrictive because you are monitoring yourself, but you're monitoring yourself by spreading out the variables of other things that are going on. So what we teach kids, or we teach adults, or whoever's coming in here, is how to do that more effectively, of paying attention to all these things that you're picking up on. It's not just you and that anxiety feeling and that's it, and you have to deal with it. It's helping them really see more clearly what they're up against, what they're experiencing, thoughts, feelings, behaviors, and then others. So it is self-monitoring, but you're really teaching them to self-monitor by paying attention to other stuff.
Yeah, it's the interactive process. Right. And for the gifted child or the gifted person, it's a far more complex, it's still human behavior, by the way. It's human behavior in extreme. That's where the complexity comes into play. Working memory. Russell Barkley would tell you it's all working memory. So working memory is the process of how you basically pull information up, processing information, hold it online, and solve problems, create insight, etc. And that stink bug is still up there. Now it's up on the picture frame.
The second one comes out.
Because I looked up, because working memory, see what happened was working memory. I look up, right? Working memory. And then there I see the stink bug. And then I have to get control of my working memory again. I have to process where I'm at, get back to earth here. We do a lot of the way we strengthen working memory really is processing. And we got to do a whole workshop on processing skills, because that's where we can be more helpful and more concrete, is to get into talking about processing. Because if your processor, and a lot of these kids don't have good processing, if the processor's not working, then working memory is impaired. And because in working memory, you need the ability to retrieve organized information effectively. And a lot of times kids have good working memory, but they have terrible processing. And so they get frustrated because they can't use their working memory. They can't get creative. They can't find what they need. That information has lost to them now, or they're so disorganized. That really creates a meltdown. It's a writer's block. That's what writer's block really is. It's a writer who has not organized the information into their memory effectively. They're putting too much focus on their short-term memory, and when they're taking information in, they're smart and they think they're going to remember it, but they're not really organizing it into long-term memory. That's a whole nother workshop.
We have a couple questions here. Does working memory?
Because do we have one more, and then we'll take all the questions?
Oh, that's true. That's a good point.
I think we have one more. Completion. Oh, right.
Yeah, that's a good way to say it.
All right. So completion, I got to say this about completion. Typically, I'd ask if the audience was right there, I'd say, what happens when you complete something? Well, if we had 500 people in the audience, this is what they'd say. Two things. They get a sense of relief, right? And then they get motivated to do more. That's literally what happens when you complete something. All motivation comes from completing a task. So if children don't complete things, they don't follow through on something, they don't have motivation to do anything else. So it's a very necessary skill. All right, so go ahead, go to your questions.
So does working memory improve with maturity?
I would hope so. God, I'm getting better at it. I'm a better writer today than I ever was.
I would agree with that, you know, you, as a writer, but also as it gets better, you know, and for me, I don't know, to me, it's like it goes from, you know, I don't know what to do to that moment of, okay, I got it. I know what to do. Like that transition from a problem that just seems overwhelming to really getting everything I need. And then, you know, and that seems to get better as you get older and older and older and have more experience and learn to rely on other people too. I don't know. I feel like all that helps your working memory ultimately.
Right.
How is lack of sleep related to working memory?
Huh. When you're sleep deprived, your prefrontal cortex is not going to work well.
Right. So all of it goes down, working
All
memory
of it.
included.
You need sleep. For the prefrontal cortex, you have to have sleep.
We have a yes, please on the processing skills workshop. So that's something we should
good.
put together. And then what's the relationship of completion and perfectionism in a gifted child?
Well, did we do the perfectionism workshop at all? We've done the talk. Perfectionism is a symptom. So when a kid is being perfectionistic, it's because they're having trouble with execution and processing. So when people in the gifted world talk about perfectionism as a thing, it is a symptom of a problem. There's nothing wrong with being perfectionistic. Wanting something to be perfect is perfectly fine. It's having the reality of, how am I going to make it perfect? Because what's usually happening is they're short-circuiting. They want it to be perfect and they don't know how to make it perfect. That's a symptom. And again, it goes back to the skill and the help they might need, the scaffolding they might need. Steven Spielberg doesn't make a movie all by himself. He directs the movie. He has a core. He has huge teams of people, right, that do this work that he directs. I always say, let the child direct a lot of the processes that they want to have happen. Teach them how to be good directors, good bosses. I don't mind a bossy, gifted kid. That tells me that kid's going to go somewhere.
Future CEO.
Well, or even more so than, it could be a lot of things,
Sure, of course.
It could be a guy running a crew of bulldozers and, people working in the field because
Right.
they know how to coordinate all that and get people to do what they need to do. And they know how to create a relationship so people listen to them being bossy. Kind of like I do at work, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead. What is the other question?
I think that's all the questions we have now. And we're at time.
Did we miss any?
With perfectionism, is anything ever really completed?
I don't know. I have a pretty perfect life up until lately. God willing, the creek stops rising.
Yeah, and I think there's a difference between Andy, you described it as like,
well,
it's okay to have artistic perfectionism. It's okay to be, you know what I mean?
Like vision.
And vision, right.
Well, here's the thing. Yes, there are times when, like when I'm painting, right? And you're painting and, you're really, at one point you want to cut your arm off, another point you want to hug yourself. But then you do something and you go, oh, wow, that is perfect. And you step back and you're like all elated. Yes, that's perfectionism coming to fruition. That's perfectly great. I love those moments. If I had them all the time, my life would be boring. I'd be like Doris Day, if anybody remembers Doris Day.
To be mindful of people's time.
Yeah, we got to wrap up.
We're going to wrap up. So if there are any other questions, we'll try to address those now. But as always, usually in these talks we're in person and we can chat with you afterwards. But since we can't,
we can see your faces.
Yeah, we can see you. We can react with you. But because we don't really do that, I'm going to go back to the slide of our contact info.
Yeah, we're going to do this again next month. But if we get bored because we don't have any work, we could do another one maybe sooner.
Sure.
The other thing is we are available. We are seeing people online.
Yep.
And if anybody needs help, let us know.
Yeah. So yeah, right. So please
And you're
reach out.
starting, as soon as things get better, we are going to do more groups. You are starting a group for young
Right.
adults, men,
Yeah.
right?
We are doing groups, but unfortunately it has to be of a certain developmental capability to be doing it on Zoom. So I'd like to start a younger guys group, but unfortunately that's just going to be too difficult right now.
Yeah.
But I
But
am
you are
doing
doing a young men's group.
young men.
and then
Yeah, I'm doing a young men's group.
But you have a group lined up as soon as we can get back in human
As
connection.
soon as it's okay and the recommendation is you can meet as a group again, then yes, I have stuff lined up ready to go.
Good. Okay, so if you have anything nice to say, send us a little chat. If you have any negative feedback, hold it for 3 days and send it in an email. And
the other thing I want
if you
to
got anything out of this tonight, let us know.
let's make sure to thank Steppingstone.
Oh, yeah.
For doing such
Hi,
a wonderful
Keo.
job of hosting. Hi, Keo and Reef.
How are you guys?
Gang.
You should let them talk for a second.
Yeah,
Can you let
that's
them
a
talk?
wonderful idea.
Mark's in control.
I think they can actually control, but I'm not sure. If you're able to unmute yourself.
Keo, say something.
Can you hear me?
Oh,
Yeah,
you
you're going through his
Wait, you need to
computer.
turn yours off. A lot of what you say is what is built into our curriculum.
Oh,
And
good.
so it's really helpful for us to hear, I don't think we labeled it as such, but those are all the reasons why the curriculum is laid out the way it is. Especially for things like the project, managing projects, and writing term papers and all of those kinds of things.
Good.
And we
I
have
like
a
that.
system set up for managing those behavioral issues as well.
Yep. All right, great. Thanks, everybody.
Sorry. So yes, we'll be doing the same format next time. Please send your emails to Keo, or you can sign up through a portal website that we have had set up now to RSVP.
Oh, from Genevieve is asking everyone to do that too.
Yes. Thank you, Genevieve. Yep. You can sign up for the next one right now through that link. Otherwise, reach out to somebody you know, Andy, me, or Keo, or Reefs, and then we'll see you next time about career development.